Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain and Qatar are enchanting. But what about the rest of West Asia? A book published recently suggests that it's very different. In fact, eye-openingly so, if not startlingly so. And here is the book. It's called West Asia at War, Repression, Resistance and Great Power Games. And its author is someone who clearly knows. He's been twice India's ambassador in Saudi Arabia, in Oman as well as the United Arab Emirates, and now he's the Sathe Professor of International Studies at Symbiosis University in Pune, Talmiz Ahmad. Mr. Ahmad, let's start with the picture you paint of West Asia. You say the Arab state is often violent because it's weak. What do you mean by violent and weak in this context?
See, this raises the issue of a tyrannical state. Why is a state tyrannical? Why is it harsh as far as its citizens are concerned? It is because it does not enjoy popular support and it is concerned about dissent. Organized dissent can lead to its overthrow. So there are two reasons for state-sponsored violence. Number one, to curb dissent. Number two, to set an example so that others similarly inclined do not take action. And that is why you find across West Asia and North Africa, the states tend to be extremely authoritarian, thoroughly corrupt at the core, totally alienated from their populations, and therefore extremely violent. That is the background. They attempt co-option, of course, wherever resources are available, like in the Gulf countries. But if that is not enough, and sometimes it is not, even in Gulf countries, because there are aspirations of people that are not necessarily fulfilled by material comfort, the people still want something more. And as time passes, this desire, these aspirations for freedom, for participation in decision making, for curiosity with regard to where the national coffers are going, all of these become issues where they become issues of resistance to state order.
Let's pick up on some of those points that you made. For instance, you write in your book, after 100 years, not a single Arab state provides for any modicum of popular participation in state decision making. National financial accounts remain non-transparent and without accountability. Though oil wealth is depleting, its revenues are still used to back state efforts at co-option and coercion. The latter now becoming more open, more crude, more vicious and more frequent. This is a very different impression to the one you get when you arrive at Dubai and Abu Dhabi, Bahrain and Qatar.
Yes. There is an allure to the Gulf countries. They are remarkably affluent. They have the highest per capita income in the world, and that is because they have very small population. UAE, many people are shocked when I tell them that Emiratis in the entire UAE are about 15%. Indeed, Indians are 60% in the UAE. So this per capita income and the incomes that come in are so colossal. And if they are distributed among people, you have an extremely affluent community. And of course, these resources have been used for the development of infrastructure of world standard. And therefore, there is a certain glitz. But it is, let me assure you, rather superficial. Overwhelmingly, in West Asia and North Africa, there is pervasive poverty, real poverty. And because, for two reasons. Number one, the state economies are very badly managed, where you have rampant corruption and crony capitalism. Obviously, whatever assets the state produces are then used by a certain coterie in order to sustain the regime rather than benefit the people. Again, you find mismanagement. You have, for example, every Arab state is a food importer. Despite the fact that you have Egypt, which has the gift of the Nile, you have Sudan, which used to be the granary of the region, you have such large entities that used to be extremely fertile. All of them today are food importers. and they are totally shattered by the pandemic on the one hand and the Ukraine war on the other. So the people, then again, employment opportunities. People are just not employed. You are not employed because of the mismanagement of the economy. Many of the things that you see across the Gulf, these are capital intensive projects. You don't have employment. Even in Gulf countries, you have very serious issues of unemployment.
And yet Indians flock to the Gulf for employment.
Because Indians take those jobs for which locals are not available.
So it's arrogance that is stopping them taking the jobs that are available.
You see, they don't do blue collar jobs. That is the first thing. So local people, the vast majority of our people, 60 to 70 and in some places 80%, they are blue collar workers. That the local people don't do. Second, there's a colossal demand for professionals, and therefore foreigners have to fulfill those jobs as well. Locals are by and large managers and owners. Not all of them have the capacity for these two challenging appointments.
But you know, the most surprising thing in that answer was when you talked about the widespread poverty. Poverty is not something most Indians associate with West Asia, and certainly not with the rich Gulf countries. When we think of them, we think of countries that are flooded with oil, petrodollars.
Absolutely
and
right.
yet, this is what you write. It would appear that 66% of the Arab population, i.e. 250 million out of 400 million, is poor and vulnerable.
Absolutely.
66% of West Asia, of the Arab population, is poor.
Yeah.
Are you using poor in terms in which Indians would understand it, or is this a relatively different form of poverty?
No, it is the same form of poverty because these are international standards and the reports are written by international companies, international organizations.
So even by Indian standards, 66%
the
are
people
poor.
are poor, extremely poor. That is why you have the Arab Spring. Why did you have this pervasive Arab Spring? Hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets in tyrannical regimes, taking bullets on their chests because they are unemployed, because they are fed up with their wretched lives, and because they feel that they have nothing to lose. Extremely poor people, thoroughly dissatisfied with their living conditions, come out on the streets and take bullets on their chest.
And this is underlined by something else you talk about, and that's inequality. Inequality always goes side by side with poverty. And again you say, West Asia is the most unequal region in the world. The top 10% control 61% of national wealth, as against 47% in the US and 36% in Western Asia. That means that the sheikhs and kings and a small silver lining of elites actually control the wealth in these countries. This is a plutocracy.
Absolutely right. You see, this is not news, by the way. If you live in the region, report upon report has indicated these facts. The first report...
This is news to Indians who aspire to go there without realizing what the reality is.
But you see, they are not affected by this. If they go under controlled conditions as blue-collar workers, associated with certain companies, do the job and come back. Those who go as professionals are part of the small elite. And they are again not affected by this. As you know, the broad description of the region is living together separately. You can live there as a professional, but you don't come in contact with local people.
But living together separately seems to apply to the locals of that country as well. The rich, the sheikhs, the kings live splendid existences. The rest are really very poor.
This is an issue that is a causing concern, because when you have wealth, extraordinary wealth of global standards, a crown prince of Saudi Arabia purchases a painting later on found to be fake for $500 million, even as he has introduced austerity measures in his own country and is attempting to cut subsidies. You see, this what we use loosely, the term crony capitalism. Imagine a scenario where you have a small bunch of people at the top, the ruler, his family, his clan, the business community, the clergy, the tribal chiefs, all of whom are co-opted as cronies in order to sustain the regime.
And this is true also of the Dubai royal family and the Abu Dhabi royal family. We read about their wives, we read about their horses, we read about their divorces, we read about the settlements. It's true of them as well.
It is true across the region. In the UAE, it is much less apparent because the community is so small. In Qatar, the community, Bahrain, the community, they are very, very small populations. We look at them as sovereign states. But when they were conceived and put together by the British as sovereign states, they were inherently incapable of looking after themselves. They were inherently insecure. They've always been dependent on the West for their security.
Luckily, oil has given the money to pay for it.
That is why they were created in the way. Oil is the origin of whatever has happened. Without oil, nobody would look at this region at all.
Oil has been the making, but oil is also the only thing they have.
Oil is really, that is a matter of concern because oil wells should have led to a very open political order where people would have benefited from good quality education, would have had a stable family and social life, would have been citizens of the region and of the world. You have exactly the opposite scenario.
I'll come to the point you're making in a moment's time. Oil hasn't led to a political development of a stable order, but oil has given Dubai the opportunity to aspire to become an international financial hub. Does Dubai have a future, even though Dubai's actual oil is not anywhere near as much as Abu Dhabi?
See, Dubai does not have oil anymore. All the oil of the UAE is with Abu Dhabi. Dubai has a port. That is its original value to the British, and which is why it was carved out as a separate emirate about 100 and odd years ago by the British. And a royal family was created for Dubai because it has a deep water port like Bombay, a safe harbor. It then built on that. It created Jabal Ali, so it became a logistical center. It became a re-export center. It became a tourism center. It has a national carrier that goes to 150 cities. So Dubai is a services center.
But has it as a result given itself a future that is now free of oil dependency?
It is completely not, I mean, this emirate is not dependent on oil, it doesn't have oil.
But does it have a future as a result?
You see, it's because you are in the services sector, the services sectors flourish if the oil sector flourishes. When you have a collapse of the oil sector and oil prices, Dubai also collapses.
So when oil runs out, Dubai's fortunes and futures will begin to dip sharply.
They are attempting to reinvent themselves as a financial center. They want to be like Singapore and Hong Kong in the east and London and Frankfurt in the west.
Can they do it?
Well, it depends on the companies coming in there. As you know, in the first decade of this century, they built up the entire infrastructure to become a financial center. And yet, in 2008, when you have the global economic collapse, all those banks and financial institutions packed up and ran away.
But what's happened today?
They have come back very slowly, cautiously, carefully, because the region is in turmoil. There's a political aspect also. You have an economic crisis and you have a political crisis.
And so Dubai also, its future depends upon the political crisis in the region.
Absolutely. Look,
let's come to that political crisis, because
Yes.
this is what you say. Issues of poverty and inequality have come together to engender in the people the sense that their state order is inherently unjust. And you add, their resentment is aggravated by the pervasive corruption they witness on the part of their leaders and their elites. To me, this sounds like a tinderbox that could one day explode.
you see, the situation is, as you can imagine, a little more complex. This is because of the capacity for co-option. Even you have such huge resources of the kind that are available.
They buy people's loyalty.
Yeah, they buy people's loyalty. And there was once a joke when I asked a Saudi that why, you are full of all these complaints, why don't you do something? He said, every time I open my mouth to complain, the king puts more money into my mouth. At the beginning of the Arab Spring, the king announced within a day or so $32 billion of doles for his people. And over a month and odd, $150 billion for supporting various, stilling the voice of the people.
How long will the oil last? Because what you're saying suggests that when the oil revenues deplete, buying people and co-opting them will end. Or Will Crown Prince Mohammed have succeeded in converting the Saudi economy into something else, using oil revenues as he wants to do?
See, this is the effort, and all the Gulf countries are committed to it. Each of them has a vision document for the post-oil economy. But the actual performance, these vision documents are now 5 years old. The actual performance has been very poor. There has been no real change. If you want to move away from oil, you should have less dependence on oil as far as your state revenues are concerned. That has not happened.
You mean they're not able to fulfill their document because they're not serious?
Even already in 5 years, there is no apparent progress with regard to the parameters laid down in terms of achievement, parameters laid down in the vision document.
Is this lack of seriousness?
It is still overwhelmingly state order depends on oil revenues.
But why? When they have a vision document and they know there's a need to change,
see, the vision,
why are they failing to do so?
The vision document, it is very difficult. It is so idealistic, put together by McKinsey and various other companies like that. It's a glossy documents full of lot of verbiage, full of charts and graphs, very little knowledge of reality on the ground. Most people, when these documents came out, the first reaction of objective observers was, in which world are you living?
So you're saying to me that actually the future for these countries may be bright at the moment, but time is running out. They don't seem to be able to adapt and change, and therefore when oil ends, they will be in serious trouble.
See, we tend to be focused a lot more on the Gulf countries. They are small, they have small populations, capacity for co-option is very large. Oil is going to be around for the next 25, 30 years, if not longer. Let us be very
25,
clear.
30
We
years
are
is not
looking
very
at
long
a
at all.
hydrocarbon economy.
But Mr. Ahmad, 25, 30 years is not very long at all. That is a generation and a half.
These are nations that live from day to day.
Yeah, but we are talking beyond that. So in 25, 30 years, if they haven't been able to change their economies, as you say, these glossy documents are not easily implementable, what then happens in 30 years?
So the capacity, I'm going to say something which is very painful for the reason. The capacity for long-term planning, strategic commitments, and then implementation of those plans is simply not there. The sense of insecurity is so deep that when I said loosely, you live from day to day, it's a struggle to survive from day to day and keep the regime intact.
Then come back to my question. What happens in 25, 30 years when the oil finishes?
Something will happen. We
But what?
don't know.
No, what?
You see,
Because your answer and your analysis suggests they suddenly find that they're looking at an abyss.
My personal view is the present order is not sustainable. Now, it is not sustainable.
So there's a crisis on the horizon.
There's a crisis even as I speak to you.
At the moment, they've got 25 years, and so
They've got 25 years.
They think 25 years is a lifetime. But in 25 years' time, assuming they haven't been able to change the nature of their economy, and you say that they're failing to do so, there's a crisis that will
I
stare
think
them
you
in
will
the
have a
face.
crisis, real crisis. You see, you already have it. Let me clarify to you. The Arab Spring happened in 2011 when there was still demand for oil. Crises can occur when people's anger and resentment reaches levels that are not tolerable.
Okay. We spent a lot of time talking about the Gulf, and I think you've changed the opinion of the audience who have viewed these countries through Bahrain, Qatar, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and suddenly they realize that actually the reality is very different. The future is not quite as rosy as it seems when you first arrive at Abu Dhabi airport, and clearly in 25 years, if they haven't got their act together, there's an abyss they'll be staring down at, if not falling into. Let's at this point come to India's relationship with these countries. 8 million Indians work in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, 3 million of those alone in Saudi Arabia. You write, the largest expatriate community in every GCC country and the majority in 3, the UAE, Qatar and Bahrain, are Indians. Do you see this continuing, and do you see it increasing?
The economic models that the countries are following, which involves use of oil resources for the development of welfare facilities and infrastructure, indicates to me that the demand for foreign workers will continue. If we have Indian workers who are 70% or even 80% blue collar, I don't imagine that number is going to come down. Indeed, it will go up on that.
So employment sources for India will continue.
Is stable. Employment for Indians is stable unless there is conflict, unless there's a catastrophe.
And the potential for that is there.
Yes. The potential is there. What about the last 5 years? I mean, when Donald Trump was the US president, he took the region to the edge of conflict at least 2 or 3 times.
Now, this huge diaspora, 8 million altogether, sends back something like $35 billion every year as remittances to India.
Absolutely.
That's a huge sum of money.
Yes.
But how has it been affected, first by the pandemic, and secondly by the impact of the Ukraine war on these economies?
The figures are not clear as yet. As a result, they are most affected when oil prices fall down, because then the jobs are not there. I mean, the infrastructure and other economic activity comes down. So
Ukraine has pushed the oil price up.
Yeah, so then it's fine. So Ukraine has not affected them. It is the oil
Ukraine
price.
is actually good news for them.
Well, it is always, whenever you have a sense of tension, a sense of conflict, there is an uneasiness because the whole order is so fragile. But as far as the outlook is concerned, assuming stability, assuming the fact that the world is going to continue to depend on hydrocarbons, you can imagine that this kind of scenario where Indians will continue to be the preferred community in the region is likely to continue.
Why are we the preferred community?
Now, this is something which has fascinated people. We became the preferred community in the 1980s. We were not at the beginning of the 1980s. I'll give you the figure. In Saudi Arabia, you had in 1982, Yemenis who were 3 million, Egyptians 1 million, Pakistanis 500,000 and Indians 250,000. At the end of the decade, in 1990, all Yemenis have been thrown out of the country because their president supported Saddam Hussein. Egyptian recruitment becomes still, Pakistani recruitment becomes still, Indians become 1 million. Why? I'm going to say something which is again very sensitive. Jihad. All of these countries participated in the jihad in Afghanistan. Egyptians, other Arabs, Pakistanis. The Indian Muslim and Indians in general totally did not participate. Not even one Indian went for the jihad.
So it's the lack of radicalization of Indian Muslims that makes them particularly
Now, there
welcome.
are other factors. The factors are the Indians are deemed to be extremely well qualified, extremely disciplined, and do not involve themselves with local politics. The Indian is seen as the ideal worker, and this delves into something much deeper, which we don't seem to recognize, but they do. The links with India. The links with India are 5,000 years old. 5,000 years of uninterrupted relationship.
Why does all of this not apply to Pakistan? They have the same links, the same history, and I presume the Pakistani average Muslim is not a very radicalized person.
It is not my business to run down another country or another people. I can only quote to you what Arabs and prominent people have told me.
And they prefer Indians.
They prefer Indians. They find the Pakistanis aggressive and quarrelsome.
Okay.
They also find that they get involved with politics, particularly extremist politics, which the Indian does not. These are the factors.
Now, the second key aspect of our relationship with the Gulf countries, if the huge diaspora is one, is oil. 40% of India's oil comes from GCC countries, 18% alone from just one country, Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
This means that actually this is a critical relationship for us. 40% of oil, out of the fact that 85% of our oil is imported, means it's a critical relationship.
Absolutely, and not likely to change. We are true. It's not just 40% from GCC. If you add Iraq and Iran, you can reach 80%. 80% of our oil comes from the Gulf countries, GCC, Iran and Iraq. India has attempted to diversify as well. And we also try to buy from the spot market in Nigeria, etc. All of these are marginal. The bulk of Indian oil, based on long-term contracts, comes from the countries of the Gulf. And that is like, that pattern will continue. A, it's much cheaper. The transport cost is much lower. It also has reserves. I mean, why we buy so much is they have a lot of it and they are next door to us.
Absolutely. And side by side with oil, there is also a general but actually hugely burgeoning trade relationship. You point out in your book that the level of trade between the GCC countries and India in 2000, 2001 was just 33 billion.
Yes.
18 years later, in 2018-19, it's 121 billion. Do you see
Absolutely.
this also growing fairly exponentially?
Absolutely. What has happened? We are not only, obviously, the relationship is founded on oil, no doubt about it. But what about India's exports? India is a major, this region is a major importer of Indian goods. UAE alone is in the top 3 of Indian importers. Why? Because half those imports from India are re-exported. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, East Africa, some other Gulf countries.
So UAE acts like a very interesting
is a
entrepot.
re-exporting center.
It's like an entrepot.
Absolutely. And it sometimes the items are repackaged. So it goes to Pakistan. You know how much Indian goods go to Pakistan via Dubai, via UAE, Jebel Ali? $5 billion.
Which completely
Is not there in
overshadows
our,
the actual bilateral trade.
the people concerned know. But it doesn't seem to bother anybody. It's a good thing. And my goods are going there. I'm all right.
Now, this raises one critical question in my mind. There is a huge economic interlinkage between India and these countries in terms of people working there, 8 million, in terms of oil, 40%, but as you said, if you add Iraq and Iran, it goes up to 80%, and then the trade, 121 billion a year, and it's going to be growing. How do these people look at the way Indians treat their own Muslims? That has become an issue of major concern domestically. It has become an issue of major concern in Western countries. These countries can't be ignorant of it. How do they view the growing anti-Islamic mood and the anti-Muslim treatment? How do they view calls for genocide made by Dharm Sansads and the utter, total, deafening silence of the government from the Prime Minister downwards?
I will respond to you in terms of my own understanding. The region's leaders officially do not make any remarks about the domestic scenario in another country.
But that's diplomatic politeness.
Yes. And just as they would not like others to make remarks about them, each one is
But they
vulnerable.
still can't like what's happening.
Now, what they did, I will give you, first I will illustrate how they responded. But there was a massive social media activity 2 years ago at the early stages of the pandemic when there was a demonization of Muslims. And that had reached the UAE because there's a large Indian
You're talking
community.
about the Tablighi Jamaat.
Yes. And there was a response, a very sharp and harsh response. It came from a royal family member of Sharjah who intervened in this debate and said this kind of abuse of Muslims is not acceptable. You are in a Muslim country, please don't forget that. And this is a country that is accommodative and tolerant. Just as you are non-Muslim and you are accommodated well, you do not have the right to abuse another community, particularly that is the faith of your host. And then some others entered, very low-key, very clear, very sharp, very emphatic, but not official. And it had an impact here. Immediately, that kind of nonsense stopped.
Well, hang on, it hasn't. After that, we had the Dharm Sansad and calls for genocide. We've had Hindu priests threatening to rape Muslim women. We have the way Muslims are targeted because they're alleged to be stone throwers and their homes are demolished without even proving they've been throwing stones.
The rulers themselves are doing their best to keep out of these issues.
But are there messages being sent behind closed doors from their embassies and their foreign offices to us? Are they saying to us that you cannot expect this relationship to continue if you treat your Muslims the same way?
I don't think, I am not aware, let me put it honestly, I am not aware if any such message has officially been conveyed at any level in India.
But if you're not aware, that would suggest such a message hasn't been conveyed, and that would be bizarre.
I think the approach of these people officially is to not involve themselves in matters of domestic affairs.
But you're seriously suggesting that these countries and their rulers will be prepared to accept and tolerate or turn a blind eye to
Well, they've done-
increasingly vicious
I
treatment of
want
Muslims
to-
in India
I
and
want
yet
to-
allow Indian trade, Indian relations to grow and grow and grow?
My understanding is as follows. While we look at them and we use the term Muslim countries, they do not view themselves in that way necessarily. They use Islam for political purposes when it suits them, particularly Saudi Arabia. But they function on the basis of regime survival, regime interest.
But they are still
national
Muslim.
interest.
They are still Muslim. They
may
love
be
their
Muslim,
faith.
But you see, they use Islam and Muslim identity whenever it suits regime interest. If it doesn't, they don't. For example, many people
But
have
that's a
pointed
very
out.
interesting point you're making. You're saying religion to them is not a political tool except to keep the regime stable. In India, religion has unfortunately become a political instrument to win votes and polarize. And therefore, this difference in the attitude to religion means that they are prepared not to accept, but to ignore what is happening to
That is-
Muslims
yes.
in India.
I want to clarify further. This is something new. Let me say this. This kind of attack up to now,
It's
till
8
very
years
recently.
old, sir. It's not new. It's been going on for 8 years.
Yes. But for the previous 65, 70 years, we were a democratic and secular country.
Yeah, but 8 years is
and
a long
viewed
time.
as such.
But 8 years is a very long time.
It has become particularly virulent in the last 3 years. There was a hope.
And add to that the utter deafening silence of the government.
Yes. The government, what I personally feel is like this. Take, for example, the instance of the Chinese and the oppression of the Uyghur community. No Muslim country has raised its voice on that subject in any degree of seriousness. Why? Because you value the relationship
And
with
they
China.
have a very close relationship
I
with China.
suspect something similar may be happening here. But I want to also complicate the situation a bit. That rulers do not necessarily, if rulers remain silent, doesn't mean the rest of the people are idiots and are not following what's happening. I feel that if this scenario continues, it will over a period of time adversely impact the image of India, the presence of India, and over a period of time, possibly even the political relationship with India.
Okay. In other words, there is a danger.
There is a danger.
And if this continues, that danger will not be that far into the future.
Because the regimes are under pressure. Don't forget that even if you are tyrannical, you have the clergy, you have the business community, you have the academic community, you have people at large who are concerned, saying that, look, we loved India, which was democratic and secular, and look what's happening there. It is not acceptable.
Okay. My last issue, side by side with this very close, intimate and growing relationship that India has established with the Arab countries and the GCC countries in particular, we've also established a very close, intimate relationship with Israel. And traditionally, the Arab countries and Israel were not just opponents, they were enemies. That's not really the case with all of them any longer today. But the interesting thing in your book is that you point out India's close relationship with Israel goes all the way back to 1962. I'm quoting from your book. You say, the Israeli chief of army staff and head of military intelligence visited India, and then again, during the 1965 and 1971 conflicts with Pakistan, Israel provided heavy 160 mm mortars to the Indian army. This relationship, going back to 1962, is not really public knowledge.
It has become public knowledge now. Whatever I have written is based on published material. Our armed forces personnel, former air chief, etc., all of them have written articles. Many of them came out in the context of the silver jubilee of our relationship and then 30 years later. So you will see every sentence of mine, there is a proper reference. The relationship, till then we didn't talk about it. And as you know, there was an obsession in India that, the Muslims will get agitated. I thought then and I believe today that this was misconceived. Muslims do not have a separate foreign policy; they follow the national policy. In 1992, when we established diplomatic ties, nothing happened. I mean, we go along with whatever the nation
But the
decides.
important point is, long before we established ties at the ambassadorial level,
Yes,
we actually had a critical relationship, kept secret.
yes.
But Israel was there helping us out when we needed. And again,
Yes.
you point out in your book this happened during Kargil. You say,
Yes.
and I'm quoting you, Israel supplied the Indian army around 40,000 rounds of 155 mm and 30,000 rounds of 160 mm mortar ammunition,
Yes.
laser guided bombs, and UAVs. From 62 onwards,
Yes.
whenever India has been in need, Israel has been there to help. And it's done it even though India would not acknowledge it publicly. And we
Absolutely.
deliberately kept it secret. And for many of these years, we wouldn't even let the diplomatic representation happen at ambassadorial level. None of that put the Israelis off.
You see, many relationships exist because there is an importance attached to them. They are not linked. Publicly, you may do certain things. For example, the Arabs. Privately, they have been engaged with the Israelis for decades because it suits national interest. I'm sure even the Saudis, for example, have had this relationship. A diplomatic relationship is a public statement. Usually, intelligence agencies talk to each other, defense personnel talk to each other based on interest. It's very
So you're
often
saying
immediate.
long before UAE and Bahrain and even Sudan and Egypt and Jordan recognized Israel and exchanged ambassadors, there was a relationship carrying on.
Absolutely, particularly at intelligence level.
At intelligence
Conversations
level?
at intelligence level. Conversations happen. People talk. You know, once one of the intelligence chiefs told me that my job is not talk to friends, is to people who I disagree with. And also, when you are brought together, when you have a shared threat, the region, as far as many of these Arab countries are concerned, the Gulf countries and Israel, the ogre has been Iran. So in the context of Iran, there has been a lot of shared information, and they work
So
together.
my enemy's enemy can be my friend.
They worked together quite robustly when you had the JCPOA negotiations, when Israel and Saudi Arabia and UAE made a concerted effort to subvert the agreement in the United States itself. They were not successful, but they were able to ensure it doesn't become a treaty. It's only an executive order which can be overturned. And then they put pressure on Donald Trump to subvert
So
it.
India getting closer and closer to Israel doesn't come in the way of India's very close and intimate
See,
relationship
India's
with GCC.
approach, as I have pointed out in the book, is founded on two principles, and those principles continue to this day. And that is the relationships are bilateral and transactional, which enables India to have relationships with a multiplicity of players in the region. And nobody in the region, we are talking so much of Saudi Arabia and UAE. What about Iran? Iran has never expressed concerns about our relationship with the Israelis.
Am I right in saying that
Palestinians have not expressed concern about our relationship with the Israelis. We are
even
able
the
to.
Palestinians have expressed no concern?
They have not. The Palestine, in fact, when we spoke to Yasser Arafat that we planned to establish diplomatic ties, this was in the context of Madrid and Oslo. At that time, he said it's good for Palestine because India will carry the Palestinian message to Tel Aviv. So there has been a lot of consultation before the diplomatic relationship was established.
And Mr. Modi took the relationship to another level because what he did was he dehyphenated Tel Aviv from the Palestine
I
Authority.
think that was at some stage inevitable, and I don't rue it. The reason is India remains substantially engaged with the Palestinian cause. We continue to give development assistance to the Palestinians. We give hundreds of scholarships to Palestinians.
And there's no objection from the Israelis.
And no, of course not. In fact, it doesn't bother them. Today, the scenario is different. Israel is not insecure. Israel is fully self-confident and able to look after its interests. These kind of things don't bother them. And they are there. Yes, you can. They have no problem. They also recognize, and I hope that this is something which is not in the public domain, but it is there behind the scenes. Israel has to deal with the Palestinians.
They're next door.
I think it's overdue. It takes a long time. You see, Israel is an ideology-driven state, and it's an ideology based on faith. A faith-based ideology is not easy to overturn, where you have very powerful clerics, for example, and you have the lobby in the United States, which
Quite right.
also impinges.
But the important thing is that you're saying to me that the close, intimate, transactional relationship, both with the GCC countries and with Israel, that India has set up, can continue without any conflict.
To my mind, yes, it can continue because, but I would say only one more thing and just complicates the situation. I don't believe the present confrontationist scenario is sustainable.
Which confrontational scenario?
The whole region, the Saudi Arabia versus Iran, Israel versus Iran, this kind, no, because when you have a confrontationist and conflictual scenario, things can slip out of control.
Which way do you see it going? To resolution or slipping out of control?
I am worried about slipping out of control.
So
I'm worried about
it could be heading in the wrong direction.
In the wrong direction, particularly, when Israel very often for domestic political purposes demonizes Iran and creates a monster of the regime, and is egged on by certain right-wing elements in the United States. You recall here how much pressure was mounted upon Donald Trump.
Absolutely. At this point, where you've raised a lot of question marks of what the future looks like, I'm going to bring this interview to an end because I think you've left the people listening to us with a lot to think about. Thank you very much indeed for explaining to the audience the complexities, but also the reality of the situation in West Asia, as well as the reality of our relationship with those countries. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Karan.